platforms. I guess I need to use the mic, right? Because you're recording the session. Might be easier anyway, but I'm going to stand here rather than. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's very exciting. This was supposed to happen, I think, 3 years ago, but then it was hard to find the right dates, and then COVID came, and we know what all meant for all our countries. So this talk, I'm going to be talking about water governance progress. Luckily, I'm talking about progress because after a crisis, we saw something positive happen, and maybe that's something that's hopefully will happen in the future in other places, but that's something I'm going to explore. And I'm going to explain about this conflict that involves agriculture. And so because of the project that Tennessee, University of Tennessee is running with the nexus of, water, energy. So this becomes very critical. So a lot of people are afraid of the future, and part of it is because of war that might come about because of water. And so all these messages and images are very common, very easy to find on the internet, and have people talk about the wars in the future and the value that water is going to have in the future. I'd like you to raise your hand if you think there will be water wars in the future. And just like, it's a very sort of well accepted idea that that's something that is going to happen. Then, of course, being an academic, and I'm very happy to be in an academic environment. That's something I very much miss about my PhD, studying, having these discussions. So there are some authors that have been studying water conflicts. And so, of course, we like evidence. We like to see what is going on, not just ideas. And this is now a very old paper, just 20 years ago. But so they looked at state-to-state water interactions in transboundary basins over that period that you see on the graph. And very interestingly, they found that in this around 1,500 cases that they looked at, they found that over 1,000 of those cases, states started supporting each other. And they started, 157 of them became international water treaties. Hostility, of course, exists. We can't deny that. Even, if a resource is used by several people, there will be some level of conflict. So it depends on how you manage it, that, what the outcomes you have, but zero formal wars over water. So that was very interesting. Of course, we need to see what has happened since and what might happen in the future. This is not predictive, but this is so far what's been happening. And some statements by Kofi Annan, former Secretary of the UN, that you probably read while I was talking about those numbers. So I'm going to move on. So since we're talking about agriculture and water and energy nexus, we know that agriculture is the main water user globally. Here you see some numbers. Still a little bit old, but it's hard to find literature that gives you data for the whole, all the continents. But I think it hasn't changed too much. Basically, what you see is in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and globally, 70% of all water that is extracted is used for agriculture. It's different in the developed countries. So North America and in Europe, that is 32 and 39%, because a lot of the water is used in industry. But globally, around 70% of water extracted is used for agriculture. And so you can't really read the whole sentence, but so I've been wondering what role can agriculture or food production might play also, in globally in conflicts over water. And here you see some graphs on what type of water is used for all uses, agriculture, and you see that 71% of irrigation water comes from surface. So that's rivers, lakes. I found this book last year. It was very interesting. It said that the word rivals comes from the use of rivers. I found it very, very interesting. And that's because that use of the water by two neighbors, and that's what rivalry and that word rival comes from. I found extremely interesting. But so 71% groundwater is 17%. You see there in drinking, it's half and half, more or less. Desalination is also happening at a faster pace, especially in some countries. The Arab countries usually can afford to desalinate water and then pump it for several hundred kilometers and use it. And then energy, because of hydropower plants, of course, there's a bigger share for surface. But this gives you a picture of also then rivers and lakes and irrigation. Then also there is potential there for conflict over the use of this resource. So now going to this particular case in Guatemala, this is a river, and that's it was meant to be a permanent river. Of course, rivers can be different. There are some seasonal rivers. There are some rivers that you can see water running just when it's raining. So, but this used to be a permanent river, and that used to happen for over 25 years. It would completely dry out. I think that also happens here in the US with the Colorado River, right? It almost never reaches the sea nowadays. So I mean that this is something that, of course, it didn't happen just in Guatemala, and this is the Madre Vieja River, but it used to happen in at least 4 other rivers, and that used to be the situation. So it was a problem, but in 2016, this conflict escalated. This river dried out earlier than in the season. And so local communities were very angry because that also meant that their wells would dry, and they were dry because of the water table. It's connected because of the volcanic soils. There's a lot of sand, and so the aquifer. So it means that if there is water running in the river, there is water in the wells, and so there's that connection. And so so this happened. Over 500 people took whatever tools they had and then went and destroyed this very rustic sort of infrastructure that used to, in this particular case, used to block the river completely and then take it to irrigate oil palm. So people did this. They had guns with them, and they were supported by this drug lord that was the mayor of that county. That type of the story that you hear more and more in Latin America, and how the drug trade is also reaching the political levels at the local level, and that's also very dangerous. But in this case, that was good because this mayor supported those local communities, and so they took action. And then the companies had their guards, they were also armed. And people tell you, even 2 weeks ago, we visited the place and we heard them, and they said how close they were to violent conflict in that particular place. So we were involved because it's very close to where we work. So then we had this march, people going from the bordered with Mexico all the way to the capital. So it became a national issue. And because of social media, also a lot of people were talking and were outraged. And so it became a national interest. That's the Madre Vieja watershed in red. And this is just an indication in 2016, the level of conflict. So this is another river, the Ocosito, the Achihuate. They used to dry out too. Then to different extents, there was the same level of conflict in other places. And of course, there are different reasons why this happens. One of them is the level of integrated water resource management in Guatemala. This is an assessment carried out globally. The US didn't do it, but most countries in the world did it. And they evaluate different dimensions of water management. So this is basically legislation, institutions and participation, management instruments, finance, and then you get, and this is out of 100. So the global average is around 51. So globally, there is a lot of work to do around water management. And this is for Central America. Costa Rica is the first one that reached the green level, which is 51. Oh, it was 54. That's for 2020. That's the world average. So Central America and the Dominican Republic, it's 30, and that's why that color that you find. And then Guatemala is this one. So we got 21 out of 100 in integrated. So we don't have legislation over water. There is no authority, nobody who will give you a license or a permit. We don't have a monitoring system. So people don't know how much water is running. And so they take whatever they can from the nearby source. And this, I call it water anarchy. And that's why the tragedy of the commons happens. So there's no coordinating body. And that's why mainly that happened to rivers in the area. So it's all, these are sort of the root causes of and what is happening in a country. But so I'm going to go back to talking about this conflict. We had the El Niño. It causes different problems around the world. For example, here we have a Peruvian colleague. She can tell you that El Niño for Peru means flooding, right? A lot of rain in Ecuador and Peru, even northern Chile. You can see the Atacama Desert, the driest in the world, in bloom. It's beautiful. It's like a huge garden. That's El Niño. But in Central America, Caribbean, and Northern South America, you get drought. You can see there what effects El Niño brings around the world. La Niña, it's the opposite, basically. Right now, we are in La Niña effect. And that is affecting northern Mexico and southern US. But this is what happened in 2016. We had the strongest El Niño this is just from 1982, but even going back to the 1950s when we started recording of the El Niño events, this is the strongest one. And it went on from November 2014 to May 2016. So it was over a year. So the rainy season 2015, it rained much less than usual. And that is also what caused a lot of problems. So you could see these headlines, these news all over Central America, even the Panama Canal. They couldn't use it for the biggest ships because the level of the water was very low. So this is a lake in Nicaragua that was drying out, one of the big lakes in part of it, drought in El Salvador. So it happened all over, even in Colombia and the Caribbean. So it wasn't just in Guatemala. So that made it worse. That's what exacerbated that conflict. There's some of our weather stations in Guatemala just showing this is average conditions. This is when you have La Niña. So you have 33% more rainfall. And this is the effects of El Nino. And this is river flow levels. So for example, 2011, after La Niña event, river flow was higher. And this is what happened in 2016. So the river levels were lower. So there is some, we have very poor data for the country. So it's very hard. Maybe I wouldn't win a case in court. But this is what we have observed in previous years. Fortunately, and this is the positive part of this story, is this level of conflict triggered dialogue between people. That drug lord who was the mayor started this sort of roundtable for people to communicate. He had no idea how to manage it. He had no idea what he got into. But then he asked the governor of the area to start calling everyone to have this dialogue going on. They called it roundtables, technical roundtables. That was just a term that was used. Usually when you have a conflict, you get people to talk. But it's basically became a watershed committee. With the department, Guatemala is divided into departments instead of states. So we had the department, governor, local companies, municipalities, ministries, NGOs, communities. Even the Catholic Church was very actively involved in the case of the Madre Vieja River. But there were other, the rivers that I showed you, the same process started. So they started talking about, who dried out the river? That was the first question. And of course, they started pointing at, some companies or some farmers. But that was the information that was missing. And I'm going to show you part of the information that we started generating. So who was supposed to be sat there having that dialogue? And they reached some agreements. The first one was to recover and maintain river flow all the way to the sea or to the next river. And that was a priority. So everyone stopped extracting water from the river until that happened. And then they started planning and looking at how much they could extract without the river drying out. So that was the first priority. And then a monitoring and verification mechanism. And then they started talking about other issues such as reforestation of the riverbank. So as I was telling you, there is no information on who uses water, let alone how much they use. And so that's a big problem. But this is data that was generated by this roundtable. They went out and started looking at extraction points. Every dot that you see here on this map is an extraction point. So there were 33 different ones. So of course, everyone would say, yes, I am a farmer. I use water from the river, but I only take 3% of the river flow. And that was true, but there was the neighbor and there were other people upstream and downstream. And it was, in the end, in the lower part of the watershed, 33 different extraction points. And some of them distributed water over maybe 20 kilometers. And that was, so there were over 60 users of that water. Of course, everyone needs to use water. The problem is not having a system to do it properly, to having a caudal ecológico, I can remember now, the ecological flow, river flow, or the environmental flow, I think it's called in English. So here you could see that it wasn't only one company or one farmer, but it was a collective problem. But this was very important. This was the first step to see where sugarcane was grown and oil palm and bananas, but there were also corn and beans and pastures for cattle and other uses. and then who was in every place and how much water was extracted. So when communities were very angry and they were shutting down all those extraction points, for example, they shut down this one, and then other communities that used the water downstream, they had no access to water. So they started understanding the system. And so they, of course, they opened it again because they were affecting other people in the area. Companies had to invest a lot of money, actually, talking about millions of dollars in more efficient irrigation systems. This is the oil palm plantation, for example. They started using this instead of the gravity sort of flooding the whole plantation. And this is for drip irrigation in sugarcane, for example. And so, because when we started measuring the river flow, we had only 10 cubic meters per second. The demand was 16. So the information was so critical to show people, you know, you can't get all the water that you say you need, because otherwise someone else is not going to have any, or the river will dry out. So information became a very powerful tool to raise awareness. And that's sort of the biggest contribution by the Climate Change Research Institute that I direct. We proposed this monitoring system for all the rivers in the Pacific region of Guatemala. So every dot that you see here are monitoring sites that we do. We have 7 teams going every day in the dry season, even weekends. And we created this app so that they would send the information very quickly, you know. So at 8 a.m. we will have the first data for the day, because this is critical for all the water users. So we use WhatsApp chats. So everyone knows that if the level is going down, they start extracting less water, or they stop extractions altogether so that the rivers don't dry out. So it's been very effective now for 6 years. So it's been a success story. We started also installing these gauging stations in some areas. It's not very easy. And then with the volcanic sediments that we were talking about earlier, this is not feasible in some sites. We already got 2 of these type of technology destroyed by the rivers, but this is something that we having now 5 rivers, and so it provides information every 15 minutes. So we know the behavior of the river on a 24-hour, but also during the rainy season, and so it helps us now with flooding and early warning systems, which is very, very interesting. This is the type of information that we generate. So when the river flow is going down, we tell the users, and so they start making decisions so that the level goes up again. This is a rainfall event, so the river flow goes, and then this is again when it started going down, and when we issued this warning and then they took measures. And this is the type, the app forces you to take a picture when you are measuring of the river, so that becomes also evidence. So you see here the date and the time when this happened. And this was another agreement. Once they recovered all the rivers, they said, okay, we need to restore the forest. So the technical term is riparian forest, but it's, you know, the forest in the riverbank. And so this is something that we did too. We helped them write over a 3-year period, the project for the restoration of this forest. That was the governor. She was very active. I must say, we've had now 6 different governors. That's also part of the problem. They change so frequently, and that's also another problem. The governor that we have right now has not been interested at all in this, following up on this dialogue table. Fortunately, communities and the companies continue following and complying with the agreements. But the best was this governor. She's a woman, very powerful, but very supportive of all this dialogue. So she also went and planted trees when we had this with students. So it became a very good also reason for people to come together and talk. And that's something that didn't happen in the past. So in synthesis, and I see it as a collective success. Of course, if you talk to people in communities, they will say it's our success because we fought for the rivers, and they are right. But that's not all that was needed. So companies will also tell you, yes, but we invested and we changed our technology and that's our success. People in government will tell you it's their success, but I think it's everyone's because everyone played a role. So you have dialogue, you have an inventory of uses and users, coordination mechanisms, information, the flow levels were, and now 6 years on, it hasn't dried out again. So I think that's the best evidence of success. The forest restoration plans were implemented and conflict levels have plummeted. Of course, there will always be some level of conflict, but you know, they're very, very low, and that's why they don't get to the newspapers. They don't make any news because nothing bad is happening. So, and then even local governance improved, and the local leadership was also strengthened. The role of mayors and governors in the area, and overall there was progress in water governance, and that without national legislation. Of course, this is not the ideal condition yet, but it was a way to have benefits for the whole area. So I guess some of the main messages that I want to leave today is that when a conflict between countries, but I think also at the local level, that might also be the case. It is more common to have cooperation than violent conflict. This is a local case. We will need to study what happens locally in many places, but at least this one points at that what the literature was telling us. And then also water management should be based mostly at the local level and needs participation of different stakeholders. Of course, that's in the literature of water management, but it's something that we've also experienced in this place. And then as we all become more urbanized, conflicts over water used to supply homes and produce everything people consume. Agriculture, of course, is not just for food production, but nowadays it's also for fuel, for example. Then, so the use of water and possibly conflicts over the use of water will increase because of this consumption in urban places. So that's something that we need to look into, because those even the consumption of some products in the US might affect or create conflicts in places like Central America, but it might. So we could also support some of these mechanisms that can help prevent those conflicts, and I think that's something important to do. And then, of course, prevention is always easier and cheaper than dealing with impacts. I think that's the end of this presentation.
Thank you very much. Any questions about this discussion? I have a question.
So did you create the app yourself, or you said WhatsApp? What's that?
Yeah, we created the app. It's a very basic tool, but it was something that you would type in the the data, and then we will get via mobile technology the information in our office. And then through the WhatsApp chats, we would send that and share that information with the user. So that's so there is two components: the app to send the information from the field, because there are all very far-flung places where the monitoring sites, many of them. And then WhatsApp was the because it's what most people use, so it was easier to create chats to share that information.
Are there enforcement mechanisms? I mean, if somebody just says, I don't care any water, what happens?
That is a very good question, the enforcement mechanism, because it's all locally done. So there's a monitoring system, but there's also people also live in the area and also other farmers. So if the river level of the river is going down, people also give they call and they say, okay, we see that the river, the level of the river is going down, so we go and check if that didn't show in the data, for example. So there is local enforcement, and also sometimes when they say, okay, now we need to cut in half the extraction that we are doing. So of course, some people try to be too smart and they say, yes, I have lowered my extraction point. Then the neighbor will say, that's not true, I just went by, and that is not happening. So that's why these local and participatory mechanisms work very well, because I don't see any government authority, for example, policing everyone, as well as how it happens between people. And the best enforcement mechanism at the beginning was, so they went to the field and they said, so whose irrigation canal is this, or pump? And then if nobody said it was theirs, they would just close it. And then of course somebody would say, so sorry, it's mine, so I'm going to participate. So that was a very, very effective mechanism. If you don't comply, you don't have access to water, and that was interesting.
So Alex, who approves if you want to have a new extraction point on the river system? Who says that that's okay? Anyone who's not saying?
Yeah, that's another very, very good question, and it has happened. They need to go to that roundtable and tell everyone, listen, I have this new plantation and I need some water for it, or I haven't used that one for 4 years, but now I planted again. But it's something that they discuss and then they decide collectively. Not very easy, but that is what's happened these 6 years. Yeah, of course, something that is very evident is that the need for legislation and to have this authority and things that are so common, especially in developed countries, and you probably don't think about, but it really helps, and probably the extreme is Israel. They use every drop, it's a desert basically, and yet they export even avocados, which require quite a lot of water. And so a lot of discussions have come since 2016 for this need for legislation. So now everyone agrees that we need legislation. What is very difficult is to agree on what exactly is included in that legislation, and that's very political, and that's very, very, very hard. And even countries that already have legislation, for example, Costa Rica has legislation, a water law since 1949. They've been trying to have a modern water law, and they haven't been able to do it. It's just a very contentious subject. So a lot of discussion, but nothing really well, I'm not being fair. There was a piece of legislation that was put in place last year in 2021, and it mandates the analyzing all the watersheds and creating basically watershed committees. And so that's providing some legal backing to this, even to these groups that are already working. Of course, what needs to happen in these areas is going upstream, because this is all in the lower part of the watershed, and you need also to include people upstream. So that piece of legislation is already helping, and we are helping the government write the management plans for 6 of the watersheds in the Pacific region. So I guess that's progress, you know, but not in terms of the general water law that we need. No.
Question. I know ICC has in the past been talking about some of these stations, weather stations, monitoring into El Salvador, Honduras, countries. Would that be something where you research on preventing these kinds of conflicts, right? I mean, they may have different water policies, and idea. So is the intention to use some of that as well with research to see, like you're just asking, community involvement?
Yeah, El Salvador has very similar problems to ours. They don't have a water law. It's coming up because they have now a very, well, I am afraid of this very authoritative, is that the word? Authoritarian government. That is, it's a new government, but it doesn't look very good. And I hope you don't show this presentation because we have an office in El Salvador. But because the president has the power also in Congress, in December, just when people are thinking more about Christmas than any other thing, they managed to pass this law. In general, it has very good aspects. I analyzed the law, and it will be in place in 6 months. Hopefully that will help, but it gives a lot of power to the government. It's a very centralized type of system, and so it depends if there are well-intentioned people in the government, it might be good, but if that's not the case, of course, you're not going to have good results. What we've done so far is have some people, some farmers from El Salvador come and talk to the farmers in Guatemala about the conflict and why it is much better for them to talk to each other instead of fight. So that's, and we're already also monitoring some of the rivers in El Salvador. So hopefully that system of, you know, providing information locally for them to make decisions can also be done in El Salvador.
Would the app work in El Salvador?
Yeah. It could also work, or in Tennessee,
Yeah.
hopefully.
So just very curious, in 2016, what happened in urban centers and how was the situation and the discussing water?
Yeah, it depends of what sources of water people use in different towns and cities. For example, in the capital, over 70% of the water is groundwater, which is a bigger problem because in some areas, about 5 meters is the annual reduction in water levels. And that's crazy. You know, they're just going, you know, it's a recipe for disaster, and they're not doing much. At least now some organizations are worried and monitoring and trying to get the government and also the municipal governments to do something. But then in systems like that, it is very hard to notice when a drought because of the infiltration processes and the dynamics of the groundwater. But in other areas, even in Coban, a place in northern Guatemala where it rains all year round, they have shortages of water. So they had to transport in trucks, in this sort of water vendors. Then that's a good business for them. But yeah, there was a problem in other places where usually they don't have that type of problem. And what I find is urban, I don't know what the case here is, but urban people in urban areas are not aware of these things, especially if you are used to having water running in your taps all year round. You don't need to worry about what's happening to rainfall and to aquifers and rivers and lakes, because you take it for granted, I suppose. But managers, and you can see many papers saying, no news is good news, and that applies to water managers everywhere. Usually when you hear about the water managers or the companies or the municipal authorities who manage the systems in cities, it is when there are problems. That's when they come on the news. Otherwise, you don't even notice how critical their job is. Yeah, sorry, there's a question up there.
I'm curious about something. How do you include farmers or small farmers into this negotiation process? For example, big companies really have this big ability to negotiate because they have power, and from the other side, there are also groundwater points of extraction that are illegal sometimes. So those small farmers use them. So how are they part of this process?
Yeah, in this case, there were small, medium-sized, and very big companies, but they were sitting together, and that was something that never happened before. But it's a good question, because the small farmers didn't have to. Maybe it's a problem, but so far, they didn't reduce their extraction levels, assuming that it is smaller amounts. But because there are there's many of them, of course there is a problem. But so the bigger reduction in extractions were for the big companies. So they were the ones who also could afford, the more efficient irrigation systems. So the smaller ones, but I guess that's an area of improvement in the future. If you help also those small farmers use more efficient irrigation methods, that might also improve the conditions in the watershed. But so far they haven't been. But there is a problem with other users that, for example, a few people connected with the drug cartels. Of course, nobody wants to mess with them, and so they don't. They haven't reduced their extraction of the river, and so that's a problem, because the government doesn't want to do anything, and everyone else is so afraid of them. So there are some cases.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about my question. It's because normally those big companies, they have like more investment or ability to invest in technology, so their irrigation systems are well better. But from the other side, those small farmers have this less ability to do that. This is why they tend to access to these illegal points of extraction. I was more thinking about like cooperatives or associations that may help to negotiate things with these kind of projects. But yeah, that was
okay. Just all the extraction, you could say that all water extraction in Guatemala is illegal because it's not backed by law. Or you could say that none of them are illegal because you don't have legislation to say that. So it depends how you look at it. But in these technical roundtables, everyone is the same. So you have all the communities. Most of them are farmers. They also work for the big companies, and that's also why they know how important it is for the water to be used. Because also, if, let's say, for example, bananas, I think that's the hardest thing. Bananas, you need to have, and because we work with them, we know you need to have exactly the same width and length of the bananas. If you reduce irrigation, they get smaller, and then they don't let you export. So it is because of all these very strict conditions by the US, for example. 1 in every 3 bananas comes from Guatemala. And we get volcanic ash, for example, falling on the banana plantation. So we need to do also warning to the banana growers that there's ash from the volcano coming, because if it reaches the banana, it scratches a little bit the peel, and you can't export it. So it's so, the market is so strict that's why they need to keep those regulations. But yeah, so in 2016, when all the plantations couldn't use any water from the river, they actually lost a lot of money because yields went down, especially the banana growers couldn't export thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of boxes of bananas because they didn't reach the size that you require. So, but yeah, so some things seem very, like all the banana growers need to comply with so many quality controls, which in general is good, but it doesn't mean that they will get any more money. They are just pushed by the traders to comply with the rules. They mean also more, higher costs of production. In a few years' time, actually, they will be required to irrigate the banana plantations with potable water. So it needs to be free of any bacteria, even though it's been proven that bacteria don't reach the fruit. Even if you irrigate with bacteria, you can control it, but still, the regulation in a few years will force them to. So it will be very, very costly to produce bananas, basically, or even, use better water for bananas than for people. So it's very tricky being a farmer.
Are there other conversations about changing crops? Right? If there are water-heavy crops and these ones are very good, like bananas, is anybody saying, well, we can use this land for something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's something they will do if. And right now there is a big problem because Ecuador used to sell a lot of their bananas to Russia, and about 1 million boxes a week. So right now, when they can't export all those bananas to Russia, so they're flooding the market. First, the Ecuadorian market, but also now everyone else. So there is a lot of competition. So of course they have always, in the back of their minds, they always have this idea of what else am I going to plant if I can't grow bananas because I can't, or because it's too costly and they won't pay what is fair. So yeah, I mean, that's always, but with bananas, it is a very high investment. It's about $25,000 per hectare just to start a banana plantation. So it's a lot of, but banana plantations employ a lot of people and a lot of women, especially in the packing. So it's very, very good for the local economy. So that's yeah, there are trade-offs.
What do they do to keep the ash from scratching the skin?
Oh, it's amazing, what they basically put paper around every banana, what do you call it, branch? Yeah. So they need to run as quickly as possible and cover all the banana branches with paper to prevent the volcanic ash falling. So actually they say the biggest asset is the banana peel, because that's what's taken. That's what the market cares about. It's the peel. It's not the fruit, the actual fruit.
Then we just throw it away. And we compost it.
So you sort of alluded to the idea of consumers having a role here. I mean, is there any action or any sort of movement to try to create a label or information program?
Yeah, I think through the certification programs, the companies need to comply with a lot of social but also environmental aspects. And so that, I mean, some companies have improve their working conditions drastically and some environmental conditions. But other companies don't do that. They need to be forced to do it. And so especially if you sell, for example, sugar or alcohol to Europe, now you need to comply with the ICC certification scheme, which is, it was German initially, but now it's been adopted by the European Union. If you don't have that, you can't export anything to Europe, to the European Union. So, and that they require carbon footprint. They monitor if you cut down any forest. And we know of this one case where ethanol was exported. There was a ship to California, and they detected that there was let's say an acre of forest that had been cut down. And so they stopped the ship. And so because we needed to analyze when that loss of forest, it was just 1 acre, but that was enough to stop a whole ship from being delivered in California. And so we helped to analyze what happened, because it wasn't supposed to happen after 2008. So we had to look at satellite images and to see when that happened. But that's how strict those certification schemes are right now. It's the same with oil palm. For example, in Guatemala, they have committed to zero deforestation, and they have to comply with a lot of environmental regulations in order to, and that's stronger than our national legislation. So in a way that helps. If you see a certified product, it will more or less guarantee, I say more or less because it also, it guarantees certain environmental things, but maybe pushing the producers to earn very little, or to go, because otherwise they can't sell. So they just accept what the market is telling them to do and absorbing all the costs. Those who never lose are the traders. I think that's where the big money is.
You mentioned avocado.
Yeah.
Talk about that. You mentioned what was happening with avocado.
Yeah, avocado is very interesting. When you look at, I don't know about the US, but if you look at European websites, the avocado is like the devil, the new devil. They are criticizing the avocado because of the water consumption and the carbon footprint, but it depends where it comes from. For example, the Guatemalan avocado, or I would say in general, Central American avocado, which includes this south of Mexico, it's a native crop. And it requires a lot of water, but for example, we carried out this water footprint for avocados in Guatemala in about 20 farms. 95% of the water needed to grow it is rainwater, because it's what you get in the mountains. It would be a problem in places like Israel, as I was saying, because you need to irrigate. And then, of course, they will be very efficient. They won't waste a lot of water because it is costly. But so in the case of these avocados in Guatemala, 95% was rainfall. And then they had drip irrigation. So that other 5%, they actually should irrigate a little bit more. And then they play a role. If you go to an avocado plantation, you see a lot of insects with the flower when they are in bloom. You see so many insects and a lot of birds going there. So they are very good for also biodiversity. And it also depends on northern Mexico, for example. They cut down a lot of trees or forests, native forests, to grow avocados. In that case, then you have a negative impact, and that's something that they were, and also carbon, because of the forest you cut down, you have a lot of emissions. But if you have any other crop, especially annual crops, and now you have an avocado plantation, then you have a positive gain in carbon stored. So it very much depends of where it is grown. You can't just say it's bad for the environment to eat avocado. I would encourage you to eat as much as you.
So where did that get funding?
The institute. Yeah, as you can see the word private, we get a lot of our, let's say our basic budget to be covered is from the private companies in Guatemala. That was a contribution to the country to, to fight climate change. And we were discussing that in the car when we were coming here with the colleagues. Perhaps because our government institutions are so weak, the private sector, but not just the private sector, indigenous peoples are also organized and working around climate change, also universities and research centers, NGOs, because we see impacts on a yearly basis. So we are sort of desperate to do something about it, especially in terms of adaptation. So it's not just the private sector that is doing something. And we almost have to demand from the government to take action and push them or work with them, as is our aim at the Climate Change Institute. But so we are able to hire people and to provide services to municipalities and communities for free because of this funding from the private sector. But they also benefit from the information that we generate for their irrigation system, for example, and the flood, the warnings and the mapping of flooding. Those are things that are useful for them. So it benefits them, but it's also helpful for society. And more or less 50% of our funding comes from projects. Right now, for example, we have funding from UNDP and from the Spanish Aid Agency for some communities to work on water provision. And next year, we're going to get funding from USAID. We've had in the past, but and that's particularly for biodiversity. So it's a combination, but this stability in being able to have full-time staff with contracts for an indefinite period of time, it's because of the private sector funding. A huge advantage. Yeah.
The areas that you forests along the rivers, there can impact on stream flow.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is in general in Central America, people think that trees produce water, that they are water machines. Of course, if you know the physiology, of course, plants need water, so they pump water from the ground, and there's this evapotranspiration. Of course, they play a role in regulating the water cycle, so it's very good for the watersheds, and so yeah, they play an important role. But so your question is very good. We haven't seen a change right now. I mean, it's just been 3 years since we planted the last. It was a 3-year period for reforestation. We haven't seen a major change in river flow. That's something that we need to look at. If you ask local people, they will say there will be more water flowing in the river because there are trees. But that's the general belief. But that's something that we'll be able to see in a few years' time. Fortunately, we have this gauging station at the beginning where the reforestation project started, and also at the end. So that's something that we are very, well, personally, I'm very curious about, what might happen to river flow. But it also depends on groundwater and the aquifer. So it might be because of the changes in river flow might be because of other or other factors than the forest. But yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it was all, especially the big companies were the ones who committed. They had to take away, to remove the sugar cane or the bananas or the oil palm in order to plant the tree. So that was, but it was a very strategic action to keep people's trust in the process, in the dialogue process, because they, and I have this suspicion that people did it or asked for it because of that. They wanted to see how committed the private companies were. So they said, we want you to plant trees here because it's good for the environment, it's good for the river, but they were also sort of, trying to see what their reactions were. So they were very surprised when they actually had to remove cropland in order to plant trees. So that was a very interesting component in
terms of the monitoring, talked a lot about flow. What about quality?
That wasn't a concern in this process, but we've been monitoring 18 of the rivers in the Pacific slopes now for 6 years. We haven't done an overall analysis because we don't have, we haven't had the resources to do it. We've done sort of specific analysis. We do about 15 parameters of water quality that we measure in the rivers. So there's a lot of data. So if you have a student that can do a thesis on that, there is the data. It's so much data we need to analyze.
My next question, collaborative opportunities. Do you have particular things in terms of the water governance for water reviews? Might be things for people to do here. Ways to work with you guys.
Yeah, I guess there are several opportunities. From an environmental point of view, from an agricultural point of view, even through the the lens of sort of export crops and all the way to political science and governance. I think there is a lot of material here to study, and very specific things like river flow and water quality. So I think there are many things that we can do. We just had, for example, an intern from a university in Germany who came and helped us analyze the river that diverted that because of the sediment of the volcano. I'm gonna talk about that. Was that on Wednesday? And another tomorrow in another talk. So there are some very specific things that you can study, or there are longer term processes where I think there are opportunities to collaborate.
And I think in terms of students, we notice that in many countries, it's the ability for a student to be exposed to the private sector is one over there, actually this companies, which stuff. And then on social sciences, or like presently kind of out in Guatemala, and the links really doing a fantastic job in really collaborating to in the government and also in society, and also making international issues.
Yeah, thanks. I think through that collaborative work that we do locally, we also work a lot with the government. I mean, it sounds like our government is useless and terrible and doesn't do much. To a big extent, it's true, but we work, and part of the problem is they change people in government so frequently, and that's that is very harmful for the country. So we have to, for example, a new governor, we need to go and tell them, okay, your desk, there is a document where everyone signed on the agreements on the rivers. There is this process. So we need to tell them what was happening and provide a copy of all the information, even though it is in their office. But so we make progress, but then they change people again. So it's an institutional problem. It's not just people who work there. Some of them are very committed. But so all the information is provided to the Ministry of the Environment on a weekly basis. So there is a lot of collaboration with them, also with the Disaster Reduction Institution. And the Forestry Institute in Guatemala is one of the best government institutions. We've collaborated with them for now 11 years. That's a very good case, but it's decentralized, it's autonomous, so they keep people in their positions for a long time. So then the situation is very, very different. But yeah, through us, because we interact so much with all these different stakeholders, you know, if somebody comes and wants to do work related to legislation or lack of legislation, then we can connect with people. And so that's something that makes things very easy, much easier.
I'm curious about this investing funding.
Yeah, USAID usually has these calls. Yeah, you're probably familiar with them. And there's usually some companies, US-based companies, that apply for them. It's highly competitive. You know, you have Chemonics, Tetra Tech, RTI, ABT, and so on. There are some other ones. And they are able, once the call is, they actually have their offices in Washington, so they know about forecasts and they know so they start working and investing their proposals even months before a call comes out. So it's very, very difficult for a university or for, let alone a local institution in let's say, Guatemala to access those resources. But in this case, USAID decided to do to do things differently. So they had this call for biodiversity work in Guatemala, just for Guatemalan institutions. So we started creating consortiums, and the consortium that we are part of was selected for this grant. It's going to be a $25 million grant for 5 years, working on biodiversity. We're not the prime, you know, so we're too small, I think. But it's a consortium by 3 organizations. We are one of them. So we were selected, and now we are in the process of co-creation. So we are having workshops every week almost to define exactly what we are going to do, but we are going to be the leaders for the Pacific zone of Guatemala. And so we are going to be coordinating with the work with a lot of local partners. But I was saying to Sarah that there might be a good opportunity to also involve some people from the University of Tennessee in those topics. And since we are in that process of co-creation, and hopefully we'll sign the contract in October, I think it might be January, because USAID is a bit bureaucratic. So we can still include, you know, collaborative work, and I think it will be very, very good there. At least we have now, you know, we've been selected. So.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about your modeling that you talked about with the flood studies. I was just curious what kind of predictive modeling that you do. So we talk about flood resilience projections, rainfall projections to see what could potentially happen.
Yeah. Most of the work that we've done so far has been flood risk maps for different return periods. So 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And that's basically, it's based on statistics. So on rainfall, past rainfall. And so we do hydraulic hydrological modeling to see what river flow levels we're going to get, and then we do hydraulic modeling to see which places might be flooded. So that's we've done that with most of the watersheds in the Pacific region of Guatemala, except for those where the Japanese aid agency had done it previously with the government. This Madre Vieja watershed, we did that last year with future scenarios of rainfall in the future. So that was the first attempt for us to try and see what future scenarios according to climate change, the different models. And that's where Dr. Fu was very helpful in analyzing, helping us to see the models that we were using, how suitable they were, and what strengths. And fortunately, apparently they were quite good. So because we had no idea, because of the lack of data, that makes it very hard. Sometimes they have very, very good tools, but they require a lot of data, which we don't have. So you need to use whatever is best, wherever you can.
Thank you very much for being here today, all of you. Alex, I'd like to set out some people on the ag side of town here. Like I was actually 7.2 columns that this down.
Thank you very much for the very good questions, and having so many questions. That's something that is very different in a university setting than in other places. So I very much enjoyed it. Porque después tenemos una reunión, ¿verdad?
Sí, sí,
Sí.
sí.
Entonces mañana voy a incluir un poco más.
Y también el panorama de
Y los temas que trabajan. Vamos a parar la, ¿verdad? Stop share. Oh, no stop video.
después para